Thanks, guys. Radcliffe Bailey's Memory as Medicine isn't the only exhibit in town. If you head over to the Wellesley Library, you'll find yet another exhibit, this one from a Massachusetts native.
Head over to the Wakeland Room at Wellesley Library, and you'll be greeted by 32 striking color and black and white photographs. The artist is Art Donahue of Franklin, Massachusetts. He has won several awards for his work in video and photography. On Saturday, Mr. Donahue met me at Sabrina Lake on the Wellesley Conservation to talk about his exhibit.
Well, it's called New England Wilds, and it's basically isolated landscapes. Not a big picture, not an overwhelming portrait of a valley from a mountaintop or a mountain range in the distance. Elliott Porter was a color photographer, landscape photographer in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He really pioneered this thing called the intimate landscape, where you just take a composition within a larger landscape and look at it, isolate it. And I really enjoyed his work. He wrote a book, published a book in the early 60s called In Wildness is the Preservation of the World, which was really one of the first color landscape photography books. And it was, it was like a Bible to me of how to do color landscape photography. And so I always try to learn from what he did and just explore the regions around here. And out west there's these great vistas. In eastern Massachusetts there aren't great vistas, but there are amazing conservation areas around here that Mass Audubon owns, or trustees of reservations, and the towns have these lands set aside. And on certain days of the year, they are spectacular.
Yes, on certain days of the year, the vista is quite spectacular indeed. So what on earth would Mr. Donahue be shooting on a dreary February afternoon when the scenery doesn't sport much color? The answer is not much. In fact, he only really came out here to demonstrate to me what his technique would be during a possibly more colorful season.
So I've got this camera set up on like a 5-second delay. So once I push the trigger, I stand away from it. So it nulls out the vibration of the camera, and then it'll quickly take 3 exposures. The correct exposure, which won't contain the deepest shadows or the brightest highlights. It'll take one picture that's 2 stops underexposed, which will mean that the brightest highlights will now be properly exposed, but the rest of the picture will be too dark. And then I'll take a picture that's 2 stops overexposed, which will mean I'll get all the detail in the shadows. And if nothing moves between the 3 pictures, you can combine them in software and get a picture that has the equivalent of like 12 stops exposure range. So as when you look at it, the darkest shadow has detail and the brightest highlight is not blown out. All right, there's the overexposed, there's the underexposed, and there's the correct exposure. People who donated these lands, and these lands were very special to them, and lands that have been preserved. I try to go there and see what was the essence of that land. What did they see? Because these lands are all timeless. They essentially looked the same way 100 years ago. What did they see in that land that they really enjoyed? And I try to find that on the peak day and take that picture. And it has to be, the light has to be right, the clouds have to be, they can't be too windy. There's all these variables that have to come together, and you have to be there when that happens. And I found that, if you see a scene one year and you take it on that day at that time, if you come back a year later, the same time, the picture's gone.
Despite Mr. Donahue's professionalism, he considers photography to be a hobby. His career is in television, where he has served as a producer, editor, and cinematographer at WCVB-TV, Channel 5.
Well, I've been there for 25 years on Chronicle, and most of that time I've been what's called a one-man band, a one-person band. Shoot, write, and edit your own story, half-hour shows for the program, which has been fantastic because just the amount of creative freedom you have is pretty amazing for a major market TV station like that.
So I'm just wondering, how has your career as a broadcast journalist shaped your hobby as a photographer?
Well, when you shoot a half-hour show, you probably shoot 400 individual shots, in that average to make up a half-hour program. So that's a lot of photography. You've got to shoot sequences and close-ups, medium shots, matched action, all these things you're thinking about as far as motion goes. And with still photography, it's just, and those shots are on the air for 2 seconds, 3 seconds. boom, and they're never seen again. You know, they're on their broadcast and they're gone. Still photography, if you make a print, something that, you know, maybe it's made all with electronics, but when you have a print, a paper print that you can put on the wall and look at, you've actually made something permanent, something you can say, well, I made that picture, not something that was transmitted through the air and is gone, will never be seen again. So it's interesting for me for the first time to be able to make a permanent image that doesn't require electronics for people to see.
Mr. Donahue says he enjoys these places so much, he wants to find a way to preserve them. If people buy his work, they too are helping to preserve those places. Reporting for Wellesley This Week, Grant Mukai, back to you guys. Radcliffe Bailey's Memory as Medicine isn't the only exhibit in town. If you head over to the Wakefield, no, we're not in Wakefield, we're in Wellesley.